Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. al-Athar al-Islamiyyah has always been at the forefront in encouraging young Kuwaiti talents in all aspects of life. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome one of those highly talented Kuwaiti who, within a short period of time, put his foot firmly on the ladder of success. He quickly became well known as a gifted architect. Tonight, we welcome architect Bashar al-Salem. Bashar graduated from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, USA. After graduation, he joined Kuwaiti Housing Authority. He then moved to municipality and shortly after that joined the well-established architectural firm of SSH, Salem Merzouk and Sabah Bihanna. Later on, in 2007, he founded his own firm with other talented friends. Kayan, as it is known, is a Kuwaiti-based architecture firm that handles residential and commercial projects, and very quickly established its distinguished mark and style. Tonight, Bashar will discuss Diwaniya, from hospitality to architecture. Of course, Diwaniya has played and continues to play an important role in Kuwait. In fact, it became a trademark to Kuwaiti life. From the time it was a simple annex to a house to becoming a major architectural structure, sometimes attached to the house, but many times independent and strikingly beautiful on its own. Of course, Diwaniya played very important social and political roles in Kuwait, but that's another subject. Which reminds me of another subject. I'm sure you know about that, so please make sure you turn off your mobile phones and let's welcome Bashar al-Salem.
Good evening, all. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for attending, and I would like to thank first Sheikh Hassa Sabah for giving me this opportunity to present a major element in architecture of Kuwait, Diwaniya. The whole subject started as a coincidence, basically. The whole lecture, I guess, was received last year. I was on a visit, on a tour of Saudi Arabia, and running around some of the universities. We were talking about workshops, design workshops, collaborating with a few universities, and running around, getting to, as part of an architectural collaboration and CSR. One of the doctors was asking me, how is the Diwaniyas in Kuwait? I said, what do you mean, what's the Diwaniya? And how is the Diwaniya, how is it going? Are people still going, and is it still on? I said, yeah, of course, it's in Kuwait. Isn't it the same in Saudi Arabia? He said, no, it's not the same. We have a place to gather, but your Diwaniyas are all known. As Mr. Badi just said, it's a different mood. It's something social. It's something unique to this city, Kuwait. It's about a place where people gather for politics. It's where we visit. It's where we hold funerals, weddings, celebrations, Eids. It's totally different. The concept of the Diwaniya is unique, and I never knew that it was only unique to Kuwait. There is, yes, majalis and so on, but not as much and not as important as Kuwait. And therefore, I thought, yes, we could do something about explaining a brief history of a Diwaniya. And at that time, we were in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, and we had to actually organize most of this presentation for the second day to do a small presentation in King King Saud University. The Diwaniya seriously was really something unique, and I think going around the GCC and definitely the region, you wouldn't find something as unique as that system or a building. But then we need to look back at its history a bit, what it evolved from. It came in from something to something. It has to start, the story of Diwaniya has to start as much as the kitchen has to start someplace, as much, it's a space, it's a building, it's a use. And a bit of a research, a bit of what we have seen here, I think, will actually resemble the whole history. We want to define the Diwaniya and the history of the hospitality in Kuwait. What is a Diwaniya? Out of a painting from the late Ayub Hussein, I think this is one of the paintings that I always get inspired of, and it resembles everything that we talk about in Diwaniya's architecture and art. Ayub Hussein, I think, it resembled a lot of the memories of Kuwaitis that I haven't seen. I haven't lived through those areas, courtyards. I haven't used those spaces. Maybe some of them are still existing, but we haven't used them. And this is a beautiful painting of his, and that was done to represent a Diwaniya on a terrace. It actually, not the Diwaniya as a space, rather than a use or a function that is happening within a house. If you could see, there is a woman down there, and Diwaniyas, some of them were actually not built as Diwaniyas, and this is where people gather. So basically, when we have a house like that with a courtyard, I think there is darb, women would probably go there. It's part of the privacy, part of the cultural issues, and men would gather probably on this top here. This is just concerning this painting here, and I think gathering to discuss financials, small politics, trade, they do deals. This is where we deal. This is, in other words, called the men's club, if nobody knows what a Diwaniya is. And seriously, this is part of the culture. And without defining a space yet, this was just a start, I think. And a lot of those spaces evolved eventually. History of hospitality. You are within the Middle East. I think hospitality, guests, is a very important factor in our lives. We really have to cater for guests. It's the part of the world where any visitor is considered something very important, that we have to show off our wealth or show off how our hospitality, it's lunch, food. A lot of the foreigners are still suffering from that, I guess, from Kuwait. It's a lot of food around, it's a lot of hospitality. This is history. The region is all filled with this, and I think it's not only unique within the area. Again, a picture that resembles the first gatherings, some of the first gatherings. Without a Diwaniya, without a structure, I think people used to gather around dock areas, around, I would say, Amayr. Amayr are the shops or trade posts that were close to the beach in Kuwait. And again, they would be discussing a lot of those trade deals. They would be doing a lot of possibly politics, storytelling. It's a men's place. It's a men's place to relax, to chill, and to do some business. And this is so different from other areas. And this is where it started to formulate into a different area. That was one of the pictures that I would like to share. But then we want to look at the region. Is there anything similar? Is there any structure that is similar to what we have in Kuwait? Is it something only unique to this region? Or we could see it throughout the region around, I mean, if you would look, that's the old plan, Kuwait, Oman, Yemen, Iraq. And I selected a few. The old city. See, this is the plan of the old city, where we have the old Sur al-Kuwait. Definition of all spaces, but nothing here resembles the Diwaniya. Possibly, that could be a possibility, but again, we wouldn't see Diwaniyas at that phase, that time of years. This is 1795. Supposedly 1795, people would probably do trade, they would be gathering, they would have hospitality, but not such a structure as a gathering space for men or a gathering space for guests and so on. And this is really part of history and the start of it. If you go to the north of Kuwait in Iraq, I think we have structures that used to be, and they're still, I think, in use. Some of them are. This is a very old, an ancient, I would say, a really ancient structure that's been used in Iraq, which is called the Mudaf, and it's even inscripted in some of the history reliefs in the British Museum. I've seen them, 3,000 years old structure that still are being erected in Iraq for dhiyafa, for hospitality, having coffee as usual, people gathering. But again, it's only unique to this area. And this is really unique to those Marsh Arabs, north of Kuwait. And if you know the history of Kuwait, I think Kuwait is a unique history. It's a resemblance of people from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. So the three cultures mixed in Kuwait. But would we see that as structure or function or elements in our history or in our designs? Maybe not. But again, it's something to study and to understand that there is actually that function of people, men gathering, and they would be probably discussing other things in that area. We go to Yemen. Yemen is also the cradle, one of those cities of the cradle of civilization with a lot of history and architecture. And we see those Diwaniyas, or I would say structures or spaces, and usually these areas are on top of houses. They're not actually part of the house, rather than be on a vertical level of the house. They too share the same issue of having a small compacted space, a private space, a place to smoke, a place to eat, a place to gather, to talk about, and a structure that has been built for the guests. And in old days, guests used these spaces to actually sleep. As you know, traveling wasn't like today with airplanes and trains and so on. Those days, you have guests that can arrive and could stay for 3 or 4 days in that space, and they would use the amenities of the house. So this is usually one of those beautiful spaces that could be seen in only some areas with merchants or merchant houses in Yemen. If you go to KSA, and particularly Najd area, which I think is a very close resemblance to the Kuwaiti theme, a lot of those elements, and Najd, I think, resemble the architecture of the Diwaniya and the guest houses in Kuwait. A small, narrow space, again, a narrow space, but that has also a reason, being a narrow space due to the structure being built at the time. Al-Wujar, that element has been picked from Saudi Arabia, from Najd area to Kuwait. That is part of the Diwaniyas that were built later on. So that's another study of what is happening. But again, it functions differently than Kuwait. And the guys in Saudi Arabia was telling me this is supposedly a family reunion kind of a Diwaniya or a space or majlis, they call it, for people to come from the same family. But nothing as unique as Kuwait, where doors are open and anybody can come in to say hi, to greet, to stay for a while, to chat, to gossip. It's a different mood. It's a different function than what's happening in Kuwait. And again, hospitality is part of it, where you have the guest being offered coffee, small foods, and possibly dinners and lunches and so on. Again, it's part of the whole region here. Apparently, there is a lot of structure that we had here in the region, which is the tent and the Beit al-Sha'r, and we could see some kind of al-Majlis. Even a tent would have a space for guests. Even that simple structure would have a space for guests. As I said, a guest is a very, or being hospitable, hospitality is a very important part of our culture. We need to give, we need to show off, we need to define the guest, we need to really be part of it. The majlis is part of where actually men will gather from different tribes and when traveling and discussing whatever matters would be. But that's part even from this very simple structure. I would go to the Kuwaiti side now and talk about mostly the Diwaniyas. A lot of them didn't have structures that were actually built. the start of a Diwaniya, some of them at least, started as an adjacent space left over or are actually occupied by men to be used as a Diwaniya. This is one of the typical houses in Kuwait City, and the Diwaniya came in as a space near the exit or near the doors that people could gather without intruding within the whole structure of the house. This became the annex area. This is where guests come in after long trips from Saudi or Iraq or Iran. They travel by camel or by boat, and they need a place to rest. And therefore, you have the Diwaniya area, and you have a bedroom that is adjacent that can be used for the guests here. Elements of the Diwaniya that started to be done. One of those Diwaniyas, fortunately, are still in Kuwait, Diwan Shamlan, and I think this was also a start of what happened. People would probably gather around to talk before having a space inside. As you know, Kuwait is a very dry climate. It's cold in winter, it's hot in summer. Actually, shelter was needed to shelter whoever was walking here or actually sitting down here. A lot of those areas used to have people, they were fine with the decha, which is part of the structure of the house, but then people needed to go inside for the other side, for those closed spaces, to shelter from wind, shelter from sun, to shelter from anything else. And this is how it evolved. They created a space adjacent to the house, and those spaces grew and grew eventually. A lot of those elements are very special to the Diwaniya. Maybe we could see some of the structure now. Again, this is not related to the guest or the uses. This is related to what you can show off. I wouldn't say Shimlan or showing off, but Diwaniya is still part of the culture that you can show off with your culinary, with your food, your services, your spaces, decoration. So this is partly not a design, it's mostly northern. It's architecture that's not related to Kuwait, but it defines something that merchants would have seen in other areas, and it's something that they bring in as structures to those Diwaniyas. So those are wooden elements that we don't see usually in Kuwait, but we see them in this Diwaniya particularly, just to have some kind of relation to what we visited from other cities. Again, some of the elements, of course, the courtyard plays a big role. The courtyard plays a big role, and now we see people moving from the street, Deche, to inner courtyards, to having structures that are built. Almost they could see them as temporary structures, not part of the built-up area or the structure of the actual Diwaniya, but actually an addition to the courtyard, or taken from the courtyard to create that seating areas around it. Another Diwaniya with a very simple facade. It used to be a house. This is the Rodan family Diwaniya in Sharq. And again, the same concept applies here. It was, of course, there's a lot of modifications. Unfortunately, we don't have any records of the old Diwaniyas or old architecture in Kuwait. Now, a lot of the city was lost in the 60s due to development in the old city. But again, a lot of those architectural elements, I don't think they would be there in those facades, for instance. But that function was a house, was a villa, was a private residence of the family. But again, they had that area to be called a small Diwaniya, which actually extended to this area, and those two areas were actually combined to create a whole Diwaniya within the structure of the whole building. And that came in within history, as we saw it. Elements, we see a lot of those elements within the Diwaniyas. And I think, thankfully, those Diwaniyas that are being reserved and preserved, because of their function, actually preserve the Kuwaiti identity in architecture. The old architecture has been all eliminated. I don't see a lot of the houses. Most of the structures in the cities have been gone. We as architects, I think we don't have a point of reference. If we want to do a design, and this is where we started to look at architecture in Kuwait, there's no reference except of those few 5 or 6 Diwaniyas that we see in Kuwait City, maybe a few mosques, but that's it. So that function of the Diwaniya and that special reason to be there is what really saved, I would say, the Kuwaiti architecture, the Kuwaiti local architecture. And some of it is existing in its original matter, the mirzam, the elements of the old stairs that go up, the exposed stairs, chandel, and some of the pieces that are not actually being there as decorative elements, rather than being actual real elements that are part of this architecture. Definitely some of the elements that have been added later on that do not resemble anything of the Kuwaiti past. Elements, again, luwawin, those also served as seating areas where there are intermediate areas between courtyards and the external area and the internal Diwaniya. Luwawin, which is an element, al-Liwan, which is a shaded area with a colonnade of columns. This is very elaborate. This is a very elaborate design, and usually those wooden elements would be coming from India or Africa. Sometimes Africa would be the chandel part, but those are mostly the Indian part. And again, it's a way to have guests sitting down in a shaded area with showing off a little bit of the wealth within the structure, possibly sometimes within the door. As I say again, elements here that we see could be used. This is a similar, I think that's the same structure that was painted by the late Ayub Hussein, a stair that takes you up to the terrace, and the terrace serves nice seating areas within the summer days, the hot summer days, I guess. And I think it's a pleasant concept that should be applied, I guess, today. And today, I think within modern architecture, we go back to terraces and using the terraces and applying some functions and seating areas and barbecue areas. But again, people are going more to external areas rather than closed spaces. And this is actually part of history. So basically, yes, we can use those areas in summer, and it could be a pleasant area for a Diwaniya or a gathering, as we see it. And some of the Diwaniyas would have probably used some of those elements. This is not a material that's been used here in Kuwait a lot. This is mostly from Iraq and Iran. It's a northern brick that's been used in a lot of the buildings in the north. But again, using the material would have different meanings. I wouldn't suggest, but it could be a suggestion that, again, the family ties and trades with the region, with the cities, with the towns that are adjacent to Kuwait. Bringing up those materials is lavish. It's as much as bringing in Italian marble today. This would be the Iraqi or Irani brick. It's a similar importance, and this is something that we actually look. The doors, again, the doors are something to really give importance and to show off the wealth of the family. The doors are something really that's unique to the region. Simple architecture is always the case. Again, I wouldn't verify those windows types, but I would probably verify that doors in Kuwait, Bab Bukhoka and so on, are very important and a very important part of Kuwait's history in architecture. And mostly Diwaniyas are using those doors and merchant houses. And again, this is one of them examples here. External areas, definitely. They probably evolved from a small deche, and this is a small one. It would probably fit 2 people, but they still have it. They conserve it at least. We don't look at this. But again, seating areas evolved from floor seating into some of the chair seatings that we see. Again, a lot of this has been remodeled. It wouldn't be, I don't think those colors or textures would be applied in the old days, but at least the elements, the deche that's been there, the actual door, some of the lighting, those bars of steel, definitely they use bars of steel for protection against intruders or for security and privacy. And there is another reason to have those windows. You wouldn't see windows on any Kuwaiti house in the old Kuwait city. You wouldn't see, and help me guys if you have seen those old houses, you wouldn't see a living room or a bedroom with a window. It's only for a Diwaniya. So this is very particular to where guests will be there, and you would be passing by and you see that gathering and you go inside. Because the Kuwait Kuwait has a very, I would say, a private society. I wouldn't say it's it is a conservative society, but people were not that open to have windows and bedrooms and other functions, but Diwaniya would have that. We want to show people that we have guests. We want to show people, guests that are walking by, that could see, that could communicate. So those windows were actually introduced, not necessarily at that rhythm, but it is part of that Diwaniya. Elements, again, I would probably say the most important elements, and this is the issue that we had, and we are suffering today as architects, I think, in designs, that we have lost our way. We lost our elements of architecture, the local vernacular architecture of Kuwait. We see contemporary designs, we see contemporary buildings, whether it's residential, whether it's governmental, whether it's a public building. We forgot the issues that we have here. The door, I think, I start with the door, is a very important element in the Diwaniya, and it signifies, again, the importance of the family living, the importance of the structure, and therefore I think that's an element that is really unique to this area. The wealth would be only shown in that door, and I think even contemporary architects would have to see it as a very important element to save and to preserve and to use over and over again. Courtyards have been eliminated again. Some of the things that we lost today in architecture is the courtyards, and this is really to the Diwaniya, especially to the Diwaniya and old houses. This is something that I think people are looking back at in Kuwait and the region to provide security, provide privacy, and a better environment. This is a cooler environment, especially even with today's mechanical systems of using HVACs and air conditioning. This could be always a cooler area and cooler element. And actually, a lot of the houses that we see today, a lot of the buildings wouldn't have any windows on the neighbors because it's privacy issues. We suffer from that. But this whole structure has been lost. But hopefully, with the new regulations, we could go back and try to grab back this courtyard element, which is really part of this vernacular architecture in Kuwait, and it's part of the Diwaniya. Basically, the Diwaniya, or the space that's been adjacent to that whole area, is what we added here. And then we have the Liwan. Liwan is also another element that is unique to those structures, and where we have people to sit down and shade and decent, I would say, decent times, decent days throughout the year. Again, this is an element that is also unique to this area. It's unique to a lot of those hot areas where you have a lot of sun and wind. You could see it in Europe, you could see it a lot in Greece and Italy and so on. But again, it's an element. It has to be conserved. We need to get back those elements, use them, redefine them, and try to put them back in architecture, in our local architecture. And Wijar, this is totally lost, I think. This is really something that has been totally eliminated, lost, not even, I haven't seen them for a long time. I've seen them in a few houses in Najd. They kept this as a tradition where you have that coffee corner, I would say. I mean, nowadays this is like resembling a small Starbucks on a side or something. But this is seriously something that is to show off some of the dilal for al-Qahwa and for the coffee. It's where we have a small fire pit for winter days. You have a lot of those on the fire throughout the day. This Wijar would not ever be off. It's always there. It's always hot. It's always serving fresh coffee throughout the day for any guest who's passing by through the Diwaniya. A beautiful element that has to be, it's an architectural element and a beautiful element that has to be seriously conserved or brought back to our architecture. Of course, the windows, as I said, windows are really unique to the Diwaniya rather than the houses. It's more implemented on the Diwaniyas rather than houses. Again, a lot of the bedrooms, if you see here, it's a straight wall with no openings. Openings would be around this courtyard, but external windows will only apply to the Diwaniya, and therefore it's something that we have to use. Young architects, again, today are confused on what to use of windows. Neighbors issues, heat issues, and it affects the whole language of architecture if not used properly. And the Dacha or Decca, we don't see that anymore, I think. That's not allowed to be done now with the new current codes. The municipality wouldn't allow you to have a Decca within your parameter of house or Diwaniya. So that is something that has been lost. It's a beautiful element. It's something that doesn't weather at all. You don't need any maintenance. If you have a Decca there, you can put any kind of cushion and would sit down, and this has been used. If you have a place to sit, I think people would sit. If you have a place to sit, that's a very welcoming gesture that you have a place that you can gather. But no, this has been eliminated now, of course, due to a lot of regulations, building codes, and nobody wants to actually do this. Nobody wants to have gatherings around their houses. I think we've seen it in the 70s and the 60s where we guys, I'm a 70s kid, and we used to go around neighborhoods and people would actually have deckchairs or chairs and looking on the passerbys. But today, it's been lost again. Communication is house, car, shopping mall, and going to office, and it's been lost. You wouldn't see the passerbys. I think it's part of the city losing a little bit of its identity. Maybe it's only in areas and areas, but I don't see that a lot. In Saudi Arabia, they still have that. They have some of the, not a Decca, rather than a place to gather where people could look, mingle and talk and gather. And of course, the outdoor seating, which is currently, we have some areas in Kuwait, which is part of the Diwaniya. It's an extension of the space itself. And when the whole thing is being occupied, this is where people go out and sit down. And of course, some of the elements that we use, the chandel has been used here as construction materials, and this actually provided smaller spaces. Those spaces here in the Diwaniya, we see them a lot that are very small, narrow spaces due to the use of chandel, which is allowing for a very limited length of space, around 4 meters. And that creates a lot of those intimate spaces which we saw. They were not intended here to be small spaces, but they were intended because of the use of that chandel, and therefore the limitation of space really created that space of intimate Diwaniya space. Today, with the current structures that we have, we're confused, again, as architects, to use spans of 6 and 12 and 20 meters, and the whole identity, the way we talk, the way we mingle, spaces are not used and not defined correctly. And this is something that we really want to put a limit. I think going back to study the use of materials in that matter, rather than having it just as a decorative element, the use and its limitations would actually improve the way we design our current buildings. And to design a contemporary Diwaniya, we'll talk about an example, a small example of how to preserve those elements of what we've seen, whether they're spaces, whether they're elements of design, structure, or architecture, in a very elaborate way. Rather than copying history, I think we have to go further and improve what we have, build on it, and try to move it from where it is. Again, it all starts with a definition of the space itself. The most important spaces, I think, and this is something that we always try to push for, the courtyard. The courtyard has been lost again due to people thinking that heat, weather does not allow, it's a waste of space, it's a waste of areas. I think it's something that is unique. We need to get back. This is something that will allow for a lot of this vegetation, for privacy, and for getting this mood, rather than having centralized houses or centralized spaces. So Diwaniya could make use a lot of that, or a lot of those spaces externally. Rhythm and designing could evolve. If we have a rhythm of L1, it could evolve rather than just picking it up from one element to another element or copying history. It has to be developed, refined, and reapplied as another layer of architecture and the development of the vernacular architecture. Looking back at history to design, looking back at how plain things are, how really seriously simple things are, but the focus would be always on the main door. The main door is the cover of the story. It's the cover of the book. It's where you start the book and you can actually begin your story by saying hello or salam alaikum. Then you go inside and you get to the Diwaniya. A lot of those structures are not there. I think this is Qasr al-Sif. I think it's still there. Some of the structures have not been even modified. That's some of the elements that we could see sometimes in most of the Kuwait City buildings, but again, most of it has been demolished. Trying to make use of those elements, trying to reintroduce the Liwan within those colonnades, the courtyard, and the spaces. The spaces here, which are against what we are being able to do. Today we have a possibility of taking spaces to different extents, but again, I think the social impact has changed because the Diwaniyas have lost their identity by having huge spaces. Within this design, I think we have limited ourselves and looked at the structure of Chandel and the limitation of spaces and the widths, and therefore creating smaller, manageable, I would say human spaces. Wouldn't go to the old dimensions of 4 meters or 5 meters, but again, something that actually be used rather than having a huge space with no conversation. A lot of the guys, a lot of the people here probably have been to Diwaniyas, but it's a problem that nowadays that we see a lot of those spaces, wedding areas or salat or qa'at afrah, multifunctional halls that don't function well, seriously, because of the space that is totally big and you can't have a conversation, a private conversation, or wouldn't be able to really communicate. And this is really bad. It doesn't create a proper space. And this is due to confusion by the designers, by the architects, by engineers, and by the users. You wouldn't feel right in that space. You wouldn't feel that right. But again, reintroducing it, trying to put some limitations, trying to really bring in those intimate areas of the Diwaniya would actually reintroduce the importance. Again, trying to simplify it in a way, trying to mass it, creating and using the elements, using the different, I would say, different levels. A very organic type of design that actually could grow with time. It could grow with time. It could grow with time as mass, as elements, and introducing those elements as liwan or courtyards, they could be easily closed off or reshaped as a small or another addition to the main areas. So having open areas, having liwans, is having more opportunity in the future to add spaces and to modify those spaces. That's the actual reinterpretation of that one Diwaniya. The main elements are still there with the main door getting into the Diwaniya. The liwan is still there. The courtyard, the rhythm of those windows is still into this design. The use of materials too. The use of materials, using vernacular materials or local materials. When I say local materials, I wouldn't go to getting mud materials or rocks, sea rock and so on. This is a material used from the region. Regional materials would actually improve your image. This is an Egyptian stone, I think. It's from the region. It's a desert stone. It allows for the dust and the weathering to take place and still conserve the image or the actual architecture itself. Using local materials is something that we have to actually look into. There is a lot of materials in the region, Jordan, Egypt, India, Iran. Around that area, I think, is plenty of options to use for our, I would say, vernacular architecture. Same areas, giving it importance today. It's a different matter, but still the openness. What we have seen here of spaces being allowed to be intermingling between the main hallway, the courtyard, and the smaller Diwaniya. The structure of all this, I would go back to the plan, and that we have different seating areas. The main Diwaniyas now in Kuwait City, the ones that are on the seafront, would have more than one space. The actual Diwaniya were the ceremonies, the official, I would say, the Diwaniya, and the less official or the daily Diwaniya seating area. And these are different functions too. One with an area that is bigger, grander, and used actually frequently. So not frequently, it would be used weekly or used monthly for events, and the other one would be used frequently, and that becomes a day Diwaniya, a night Diwaniya, and some of them actually wouldn't even close. They would be open throughout those times. And within the design, using that as an element of getting this closed for this to be private, but then you would have the access, a right-of-way access within the doors through the colonnade to go to this area with any time. Spaces, again, you see that intimate space. You can converse, you can talk, you can communicate rather than having open spaces with no reason. This is also part of what we have seen. We modified it a bit. We added another 20%, 4 to 6 meters, rather than having a 20-meter wide seating area with no communication. So this is part of those intimate areas that we can create within the space of a Diwaniya. And getting materials from inside to outside is just part of the theme. Luwawin and the doors, closable doors, I think within using the same element, keeping that element of a liwan, doubling it rather than having one element of a pillar, having different designs, and creating again the doors, the side doors that also show importance to that Diwaniya. This is partially also signify that this is the main entrance and this is another entrance for another important space. Different use of materials is also signified by this use of different textures. We've seen in old houses how weathering affects walls in old Kuwait City, and I've seen it in the GCC. When we have a smooth wall, then we see a very weathered wall of stone, or the stone would be exposed. And this is just imitating it rather than copying it in a very contemporary way of having to use rough stone to recreate the actual inner skin of the building, and then the actual smoother stone which actually resembles the finished product. Again, without copying, without regenerating the same architecture, is developing it, adding it. Using stone is different than using plaster or using mud. So this is different than what's been done in the region. The courtyard, again, this is the main thing. And a lot of people would think it's not used, it's not tolerable, the weather would not be allowed, but I think this is the main function. And a lot of the Diwaniyas that we see today would have that nice, intimate outdoor area preserved within the structure, and seriously, that becomes the main daily use of seating area and the daily gathering rather than using those spaces. So this is another additional area for hospitality and for people to stay and not actually use the whole structure. The use of materials, the use of simple materials, the use of simple forms. The Kuwaiti architecture has been known by using the less is more, I would say, without even having it. A wall, a small door, a window, but the materials actually make all the difference. The lines of materials, and we try to see that in old architecture and the new architecture of having the lines, the actual lines that we see in windows would be used again in a similar manner, whether it's wood, whether it's the stone, it all is part of the architecture, but it's a simple double architecture. And thank you for that.